Hello and welcome to Chapter 3 of Business 101, where we're going to talk about businesses in global markets. This is a very important chapter. Why? Because we live in a global economy. The United States participates heavily in trading with other countries. One thing that might surprise you about the global economy is that North America has only 7.5% of the world population. Where is the bulk of the world population? Well, that would be in Asia, who has 60%. So North America only about 7%. Asia has about 60%. So if you are a business and you want in the United States and you would like to expand your business, what is one of the easiest ways of expanding your business, and we'll talk about this in other chapters, is to go overseas. Why? Because you now, instead of having a few million people as your consumer base, you'll have a few billion people as your customer base, right? So one of the easiest ways of expanding your business is to go overseas. And the population is continually growing by about 75 million people per year. By 2050, there's expected to be about 9 billion people in the world. Now think about that. What is that population growth going to do? How is it going to affect the world? How is it going to affect the economy? If you are starting a business, how is it going to affect your business? Well, you might think about it. The more people there are, well, guess what that's going to happen? That's going to increase the demand for basic things like food, clothing, shelter. So population growth, what is that going to do? That's going to increase needs for basic items. And you might stop this video and kind of think to yourself, what other things is that going to affect? Now, companies that participate in global trade will be doing what's called importing and exporting. So these are two basic key terms that you must know from this chapter: importing and exporting. Importing is when you buy products from another country, and exporting is when you sell products to another country. The U.S. is the largest importer in the world. Now think about it. The U.S. has about 77% of the world population, yet we are the largest the largest importer, meaning we consume quite a lot of goods and services, right? And not only are we the largest importer, but we're the second largest exporter in the world. What does that mean? That means we also produce a lot of products and we sell them to other countries with only 7% of the world population. I think that's pretty amazing. Now, why might a country want to participate in global trade? Well, global trade, it allows you to get things that you don't have, right? So you're trading with other countries. So maybe in the United States, we don't have coffee beans. So we trade with other countries that have coffee beans, right? Global trade allows you to get goods and services that you might not have, and maybe you can focus your resources on producing things that you are really good at producing. And we'll talk about that. That's called a comparative advantage, where you get to focus your resources on things that you can produce most efficiently. Okay. Now, when you're trading with other countries, many countries have tariffs and other laws and regulations that kind of limit trade. Now, there are a lot of proponents to something called free trade. What is free trade? Free trade is when you drop all those tariffs, you drop all those laws and regulations that might be a barrier to trade. Some pros of free trade are that it allows you more access to all these goods and services, right? So instead of just being able to get goods and services within your country, now you can have access to goods and services from all over the world. So what else does it allow you to do? It allows countries to focus on their comparative advantage. So just producing things that they are good at and importing other goods and services. It also increases innovation. Why might it increase innovation? Because now you're businesses are competing against on a global scale. So now they need to produce things as efficiently and productively as they possibly can. And a business now has access to all these other customers, and so they might be, instead of just producing products that might be local for local consumers, now they can think about things that, what might somebody in the United States, somebody in China might think, okay, what might somebody in the United States really want, and produce and think about that product and produce that product. Now, there are some cons to free trade, which is why countries have laws and regulations, right? So it might affect domestic workers. So for example, if the United States has free trade, then some of our workers, our domestic workers, might lose their jobs because now, we have high wage versus other countries. So now those jobs might shift to other low wage markets. Or instead of those jobs shifting, maybe we'll have to take pay cuts. Maybe companies here in the United States might move to other countries. So there was a big debate. It was very controversial when Hershey moved their main operation from Hershey, Pennsylvania to Mexico because it lost a lot of jobs here and when they moved overseas. And domestic companies can lose their comparative advantage when other competitors build more advanced technologies, or they just have lower wage, so they can undercut those companies and their comparative advantage. So pros and cons to free trade. I've talked a lot about comparative advantage, so let's delve into that and talk about what is a comparative advantage versus an absolute advantage. Now these two are very confusing. You might want to stop this slide and really think about this slide. You'll definitely have these ideas on your quizzes and exams coming up. A comparative advantage is when a company, or a country, should produce the products that it produces the most efficiently. I know that sounds silly and like a duh thing, but let's think about it. So China, let's say they are making a decision whether to produce smartphones or computers. Which one should they? So when they're making that decision, they should think about what's called opportunity cost. Okay, so maybe they can, let's just assume that these two items sell for the same amount. So opportunity costs are the inputs, right? Land, labor, time, effort, that it would cost them to make each of these items. So let's just say they can make a smartphone with 5 workers versus it takes 7 workers to make a computer, right? So which should they choose to make? If they sell for the same price, well, they should focus on the biggest bang for their buck. And if they are competing in a global economy, maybe they can produce the smartphones and then they can import computers. Okay. Versus an absolute advantage. An absolute advantage is when they have the same resources, the same inputs. So for example, let's just say Japan and Italy, they both have 10 workers, right? Now those 10 workers in Japan can make 3 sports cars versus in Italy, those 10 workers can make 7 sports cars in a day. So who has the absolute advantage? Well, Italy has the absolute advantage. So given the same resources, who can produce more? Comparative versus absolute. Measuring global trade is very important. So how do we measure global trade? It is called balance of trade, which brings us to our first critical thinking question. The first critical thinking question asks us whether or not the U.S. promotes or discourages businesses to export goods. Why or why not? Well, typically when you're talking about trade, you want to export more than you import. So balance of trade is exports minus imports. If you have a positive number, then that's a surplus, and that's favorable. If you have a deficit, then that's considered unfavorable. So let's think about it. If companies in the US are exporting goods, that means that production is higher than the demand here in the United States. So maybe the companies here are producing lots of goods and services, and they're taking the extras and they're exporting them to other countries. That means that production is high. Versus what if the companies in the United States were only producing goods and services that would be consumed here in the US, nothing left over, then that would decrease the production here in the United States, which isn't good, because the more that we are producing, the more jobs, the more we can get in tax revenue, because now we're producing goods that are being sold, and when you have a sale, the government collects taxes. And so the higher production generally means the more that that economy is thriving. So we definitely do want to have a trade surplus, or we definitely do want to encourage companies to produce lots of goods and services, enough to export those goods to other countries, right? So we have trade surplus, we have trade deficit. The fourth critical thinking question asks you, hey, if imports are 2 million and exports are 2.3 million, then what is the balance of trade? Is this a surplus or a deficit? Now remember, balance of trade is the amount of your imports and exports. So how much are you importing versus how much are you exporting? So it's your exports minus your imports. Balance of trade is your exports minus your imports. Now, if you're a company and you're thinking about reaching a global market, there are several strategies that you can do to achieve this goal. Starting from the least amount of risk and control and profit to the most amount of risk, control, and profit. So licensing, that's the least amount of risk, but it's also the least amount of profit, to all the way over to foreign direct investment, which is the most amount of control, the most amount of risk, and the most amount of profit. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. So this is kind of like a from least to greatest. The first two strategies are licensing and exporting. Licensing is when you have the licensor, so somebody creates Baby Shark, right? They now become the licensor, and you have another company that makes, let's just say they make plush toys, and they say, hey, can I use your trademark, your Baby Shark, and make Baby Shark plush toys and sell them? And you say, sure, you can sell them if you give me a royalty or a little fee. I'll let you use my trademark, my Baby Shark. You can make lots of Baby Shark plush toys, right? When you license, you are just collecting that small royalty fee, and you don't really have any control over that company that's using your trademark. You don't have any control about what quality the plush toy is being produced at. You don't have any control of what kind of labor they're using. Are they using little kids in China to make your plush toy? All you have is that royalty. Hey, you can use my trademark. Exporting, on the other hand, is when you are creating a product within the United States domestically. So, for example, a United States company produces a product within the United States, and then they ship it off to other countries. That's exporting. Now the next one is franchising. So remember, we're going from the least amount of risk and reward to the most amount of risk and reward. So franchising is somewhat in the middle. Franchising is a contractual agreement between a business to use their products and services in a given area. So for example, McDonald's is a very popular franchise. So how's a franchise different from licensing? Well, not only are you letting them use their name, but you are also allowing them to sell your goods and services. So now you're using their goods, you're selling their goods and their services when you're franchising. And of course, now you have a higher risk and a higher reward. So now you're paying more fees than licensing, but you have more reward. Right? Now, when you use a McDonald's franchise, there's lots of benefits to franchising that we'll talk about in other chapters. It's already an established brand name, so you have less risk of failure because people know that brand name, so they are more likely to come shop at your business. And then there is contract manufacturing. Contract manufacturing is when you say, hey, I need to produce, let's just say, 10,000 sneakers, but my little facility, it can only produce 2,000 sneakers, but I need 10,000 because that's how popular my sneakers are. So what do? You contract other companies that have the ability to make your sneakers, and you say, hey, make me 8,000 sneakers. And they make you those 8,000 sneakers. You pay them for those 8,000 sneakers. And then you have those sneakers and you put your trademark on them. That's contract manufacturing. And this is actually a form of outsourcing. So it's maybe you have another company make your goods for you, and then you pop your label on it and you sell it. The last two are actually not the last two. The next one is joint venture and a strategic alliance. These are very similar to each other. A joint venture is when two or more companies come together for a single project, versus a strategic alliance is more of a long-term partnership. Now, a good example of a joint venture is when Doritos and Taco Bell, they came together to make the Doritos logos. That's one little project that they did together. Okay. The difference between that and a strategic alliance is that a strategic alliance is more long-term. So, for example, Starbucks and Barnes & Nobles. When you go to Barnes & Nobles, there's a lot of Starbucks embedded in them. That's because they created this long-term partnership or a strategic alliance together to help both build a competitive advantage. Now, in both a joint venture and a strategic alliance, both companies are still separate. So the companies are completely separate. They're just coming together for either a short-term or a long-term project. The last one is the most risky. It is called foreign direct investment, or FDI for short. Foreign direct investment means you have a company here in the United States. Let's just say Hershey chocolate is here in the United States, and they decide to build a permanent property or a permanent facility in another country like Mexico. That would be considered FDI. Now, it's the most risky when you set up a business, a physical business in another country. You have to know a lot of their legal requirements. You need to know their trade regulations. There's a lot of things that go into FDI, which it makes it the most risky, but it is also the most rewarding because you have a lot of control. So when Hershey decides to make a plant in another country, they still maintain a lot of control over quality, who's being hired, all those things. Many companies that choose to do FDI, those are your larger companies like your Kellogg's, your McDonald's, your P&G. And we call those companies multinational corporations, or MNC. And you'll see that, so you must know this terminology, multinational corporation. It's a company that produces products in another country and has stock ownership and management in other countries, in more than one country. So they manufacture products in other countries, and the ownership is also in multiple countries. When companies decide to do business with other countries or in other countries, they might want to think about what's called the exchange rate. That's the value of one nation's currency relative to other currencies. One question, the critical thinking question number 5 that you have, is typically the most confusing for students. Now, why might a company care about the exchange rate? Well, if you're in the US and you're going to another country like Greece, and that country has volatile exchange rates, meaning one day it's exchanging at 20, I forget what currency they use, but 20 per dollar versus the next day it's 10 per dollar. If it's a volatile currency, you might not want to do business in that country versus if it's a stable economy. Let's talk about the critical thinking number 5 example. So it talks about the exchange rate. It says, hey, if the exchange rate in the US and Mexico was $1 per 15 pesos, and then later on it became $1 to 20 pesos. Now what's happening to US dollar? Is it becoming stronger or weaker? So first, $1 made 15 pesos, but now $1 makes 20 pesos. So what is happening to the US dollar? It's becoming stronger, right? So then it asks, well, it's not asking whether the US dollar is going to become stronger or weaker. It's asking what would happen to US imports and exports. So if you, as an American person with US dollars, can now have more buying power, and now you can buy more goods with your $1 than in Mexico than you did before, would you increase your buying or decrease your buying, right? So now your $1 can make 20 pesos, so it's now stronger. Is that going to increase or decrease your buying of Mexican goods and services? Now think about that. You might want to pause this video. And then let's go backwards. Before, your 15 pesos made a US dollar, and now it's going to take 20 pesos if you're in Mexico to make $1. So now your currency has gotten weaker. It doesn't purchase as many US goods and services. So what would happen to your purchasing? Would you now continue to buy US goods and services if your peso got weaker? Or would you increase your buying of US goods and services? The last few slides talk about trade protection and world regulations. So trade protection, a tariff can either be protective, meaning that you're trying to raise the price of imports so to discourage imports, or they can be for revenue purposes, or really for both. Revenue is to raise money for your government, so now you're collecting money and that's going directly to the government. A trade protection can be in the form of an import quota. So we had tariffs, and then we also have an import quota or an embargo. A quota is, hey, you can only import this many goods for this year. An embargo might be a complete ban on things like Cuban cigars. Last but not least, we have a couple of famous trade agreements. Make sure that you read your textbook regarding these, since they will be on your quizzes and exams. Don't forget that this PowerPoint is not supposed to be a replacement for reading your text. It's supposed to supplement reading the text. So please, if you haven't already read the chapter, go through, read it, and hopefully this video helped bring all the ideas together.